Mr. Century was twice the recipient of the TRAPS Award, which recognizes outstanding contributions by the Canadian Society of Petroleum Geologists. We'd like to thank Jack for coming to Northern Alberta, spending the last week with us, and please join me in welcoming Mr. Jack Century.
Tonight, it's really the culmination of 4 interesting evenings, and this seems to be the best turnout ever, and I hope to do justice to your interest in this topic tonight. So good evening. It's a pleasure to be here tonight, speak tonight. I want to thank the Peace River Environmental Society for the invitation to present this talk before Peace River area communities this past week. Now, since there's a lot to cover in an hour, I'll start right now. You see the title slide, Earthquake Risks of Building a Nuclear Power Plant near Peace River, Alberta. In order to fully discuss this broad topic, it's necessary to cover 3 related themes. First, some basic geology and energy supply issues. Second, earthquake hazards on the Peace River Arch, with global examples of human-induced oil patch earthquakes. Third, how this relates to the crisis of global warming and climate change. And finally, some conclusions and solutions. The most important message tonight for me to get across to you is on the screen. Developing our resources does not have to cost us the earth. This applies to all energy supplies, including proposals to locate a nuclear power plant on top of the seismically active Peace River Arch. In April 2007, I presented tar sands key geologic risks at a Geological Survey of Canada meeting in Calgary, attended by 25 GSC geologists. 2 main issues were discussed at this meeting. 1, the risk of earthquakes induced by the mining and removal of billions of tons of overburden tar sands and bitumen. And 2, increased CO2 emissions from surface mining and by in situ bitumen extraction and upgrading methods. After my GSC presentation, I was encouraged to continue this work by Dr. Walter Nazarchuk, a former director of the Geological Survey of Canada, and have been doing so ever since. 9 months after warning that human-induced earthquakes could result from aggressive tar sands development, a magnitude 3.8 earthquake occurred near Fort McMurray and will be discussed later. This is the basic outline I followed in more than a dozen talks over the past 2 years. Introduction is some historical background information. Global tar sands and Alberta tar sands with another example of a heavy oil field in China. CO2 sequestration risks, induced seismicity or human-induced earthquakes, fractures, both a blessing and a curse, nuclear energy hazards, Yucca Mountain, a classic example of a radioactive storage mistake, CO2 and human population, and conclusions. As background, it's important to briefly review a conference I chaired over 20 years ago titled Geology and Petroleum Markets. This conference was organized in response to dramatic changes to the Canadian oil patch in the 1970s when the price of a conventional barrel of oil jumped from single to double digits. This 5-day event was the 25th anniversary of the National Conference on Earth Science, sponsored by the CSPG, Canadian Society of Petroleum Geologists, and the University of Alberta Department of Extension, held at the Banff Center in 1988. This is a group photo of 10 experienced energy professionals that spoke about the future of the global oil and natural gas industry. This conference discussed how these changes would directly affect Western Canada in years to come. I'll start by introducing Chuck Masters, front row right, a former Amoco colleague of mine. Chuck came from the headquarters of the U.S. Geological Survey near Washington, D.C. He was the head of the USGS worldwide assessment of undiscovered oil and gas resources and lectured about that very timely project. Chuck also gave reasons for the prolific nature of Middle East conventional oil supplies. He described this as being the perfect kitchen, recipe of organic ingredients, temperature, pressure, timing, and other unique geologic conditions for creating the most abundant and cheapest light oil supplies in the world. Next to Chuck from France is Pierre de Prairie, one of the world's top energy economists and the honorary chairman of IFP, the French Petroleum Institute. Pierre reviewed important economic factors in determining all energy supplies. Front row center is L.F. Ivanhoe, an early King Hubbard disciple. Ivanhoe later published about peak oil production on a global scale. As you know, King Hubbard only did it for the United States. Ivanhoe lectured about the world oil shocks of the 1970s and also the prophetic permanent oil shock. He explained why global oil production would level off, eventually entering a permanent decline. Ivanhoe predicted reaching peak oil production would dramatically increase the price of crude oil, which indeed spiked at $147 a barrel before collapsing last September. A lively discussion occurred between several speakers and participants about the future of the Alberta oil sands development. Mr. Ivanhoe was firm in his belief that the oil sands would never compete with cheap Middle Eastern oil supplies, that Masters had previously explained to us. Ivanhoe claimed Alberta oil sands operations would always be more expensive than conventional oil because extracting and converting bitumen to synthetic oil was a costly manufacturing process. Surface environmental problems of water supply and pollution were only briefly discussed at this conference. Issues of emitting increasing amounts of CO2, global climate change, and future health problems were not even on the oil patch radar screen 20 years ago. However, a year later, all this began to change when the CSPG, the Canadian Society of Petroleum Geologists, Environmental Geology Division, was created and given executive approval. We were in business in January 1990 with our first monthly technical meetings and continued for years. For almost 2 decades, there have been vigorous debates about global warming and climate change among CSPG and APEGA members and are still raging today. This is the Environmental Geology Division booth at the 1990 CSPG Annual Convention. At that time, we were mainly concerned with issues illustrated on this poster. For example, problems like the tragic supertanker, the Amoco Cadiz, oil spill on the Brittany coast, displayed by a satellite image on the upper left panel. Resolving various oil patch and environmental conflict issues were shown on the right panel. We have not yet addressed the problems of CO2 and global warming and climate change. In order to better understand changing global energy challenges we're facing today, let's step back and see where this all started from. This is the site of the Colonel Drake shallow light oil discovery in Pennsylvania 150 years ago. Of course, all Canadians know Ontario beat Colonel Drake to the punch by a year. About the same time, shallow conventional oil was being discovered in other parts of the world. However, it took 50 years before the full impact of the discovery of this new energy source became widespread. The internal combustion engine had to be invented, followed by the refining and marketing of gasoline at low cost. Later, assembly lines in Detroit and Windsor put thousands of people to work making cars. Today, we face an even more challenging energy paradigm shift. This is an historic photo of hundreds of barrels of whale oil being offloaded from sailing ships on the docks of New Bedford, Massachusetts, about the time of the Drake and Ontario shallow light oil discoveries. This photo is symbolic of the slow economic transition between whale and crude oil supplies in North America.